I'm joined today by Jeremy Leibler, the president of the Zionist Federation of Australia, to talk about anti Semitism, the relationship between the diaspora and Israel, and the rocky relationship between the current Australian government and the Netanyahu government. Thank you for flying all the way just for us.
Any time,
What was it,
any
20,
excuse.
20-hour flight?
Yes, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So thank God for the Abraham Accords.
Hopefully it'll expand. Australia is dealing with some anti-Semitism, some struggles with anti-Jewish animus in its communities. For those who might not be familiar with what's going on over there with the Jewish community, can you give us a brief kind of rundown?
Sure. So I think in many ways, like with many parts of the Jewish world, life has fundamentally changed for Australian Jews since the 7th of October. And I say that because I was born in Melbourne in Australia, and, the President Herzog used to call it the new golden Medina, and I really I would go to school and university wearing a kippah. I really never, ever experienced any anti-Semitism whatsoever. And I think what I and many people in the community have discovered, that there was this anti-Semitism that we heard about and learnt about as children, because we are very much a post-Holocaust community, the highest proportion of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel anywhere in the world.
Right.
It was clearly bubbling under the surface, and the 7th of October has allowed it to rise up above. And I think that, it's pretty clear now, we're 2 years out since the 7th of October, that life will not return to what it was in the same way. And that's, I think, it's a confronting proposition for a community that was never used to experiencing any real anti-Semitism.
Was it bubbling underneath the surface beforehand when you were growing up, or is the bubbling a new development as well?
Well, I think if you'd asked me this question before the 7th of October, and again, I grew up, with second generation Holocaust survivor, two aunties who I grew up very closely with around the table, were Auschwitz survivors, and I often rejected this idea that anti-Semitism never goes away. And because I grew up feeling, in a society that, was easygoing, and never experienced it at all, even though, I was very visibly Jewish. But I think that they were probably right, that while we didn't feel it, it was there, because the speed at which those who harbored these feelings were then given permission to allow them to be, ventilated and articulated, because of these false accusations of genocide thrown at Israel and Zionists, and we are a very Zionist community, it didn't take much for, I guess, the memory of the Holocaust that perhaps kept that anti-Semitism under the table to rise above it. And once it's out of the bag, it's very difficult to put back in.
So the bubble was burst on October 7th. People felt there were permission structures created for them to go out to the Opera House in Sydney and call for the death of Jews, or search for Jews at the very least, depending on who you ask what happened. And you've seen mass arsons of synagogues, of Jewish businesses, mass vandalism, destruction of vehicles, graffiti, and a lot of this, where it's stemming from, it's kind of a confused story, because the police at first said, well, it was a con job. It was a criminal undertaking by a gang that was seeking to reduce their criminal sentences by helping the police with crimes that they with terrorist plots that they had initiated, and that was the story for a long
in respect
time.
of one of the incidents.
In respect to multiple incidents, it wasn't all of it was never all of the incidents, but it was a lot of them. And then we heard this huge breaking news that Iran was behind at least two incidents of significant anti-Semitic arson, and possibly more. And at least one of these incidents was also linked to the con job network. And the con job theory has never really been retracted, and we're still waiting for some results on on the investigation for what's happened with the Iranian network. So we don't know what extent, at least I don't know what extent that they're connected. And now the Mossad recently expanded on the information about the Iranian network that supposedly was leading this campaign of hate against the Jewish community. So what is the Jewish community supposed to believe? Do you feel any safer with these two theories out there? Are these theories in competition? Do you believe any of them?
It is complex because it is not uncommon for foreign actors to use local criminals to carry out attacks. And notwithstanding that, when there's, we know with certainty because, ASIO, the equivalent of the Mossad in Australia, has come out very clearly and said that Iran was behind some of these attacks. Australia rightfully has sent home the Iranian ambassador and is taking steps to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So, whether or not, one of the synagogues that was targeted was around the corner from my house, but it is a Haredi shul that are not Zionist.
Right.
And it is called Adas Israel Synagogue. And it may well be that is one of the reasons why that Beit Knesset was targeted. We don't know how sophisticated they were, but I think it's extremely, on the one hand, very confronting for the Jewish community to think that there is foreign interference. We're on the other side of the world. It's a relatively small Jewish community. That is a very confronting thought. At the same time, I've got to be honest with you, I find the anti-Semitism that has not necessarily turned violent yet, but has appeared in what would otherwise be polite circles around the dinner tables, around the boardrooms, in progressive spaces, in universities, in the arts sector. I actually find that a lot more confronting because these are people who otherwise, they are the beneficiaries of enormous Jewish support, not just philanthropic support, but in many, many respects, they work with us. With my professional hat on, I'm a lawyer and my firm has a very, very large public interest law pro bono practice where we do work both for the Jewish community but also in the arts. And we found very, very quickly after the 7th of October, within a week or two, before Israel had even responded, we found a very significant proportion of that client base were explicitly anti-Semitic. They were accusing Israel of genocide before they'd responded. They issued statements attacking Israel without condemning Hamas. And these are industries that Jewish donors, artists have been, really built in Victoria, in particular in Victoria. And that sense of betrayal from people, not from the Muslim community, not that have skin in the game, people who have been in our houses, often artists whose paintings are hanging on our walls, in our offices, in our homes. Forget picking up the phone to say, are you okay? Are your family and your friends okay? But turned on us in a way I think that was highly, highly traumatic for the community. In some ways more traumatic than these physical acts of violence that are very confronting and terrifying, but different.
Can you give us an example of how that anti-Semitism is manifesting? But because some might argue that, calling Israel genocidal, we could say it's a lie, but it wouldn't necessarily be anti-Semitic in some people's eyes.
I think when you take a term like genocide that was effectively created to describe, the enormity of the Holocaust, and you apply it on the 15th of October 2023 to Israel, I think it's very difficult to describe it as anything but anti-Semitic. But the examples are absolutely explicit. There is a facility, an artist's precinct that was built in partnership with the Victorian government and philanthropy, and it was literally entirely Jewish philanthropy, including us. And there was an exhibit at this facility, I think it was on the 9th or 10th of October, a very fringe indigenous group, and held up signs saying, "White dog Jews, Israel must be wiped off the map." This is within a week of, the worst terror attack on Israel and the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And the institution, while did call it out as anti-Semitic, refused to condemn Hamas. in doing so on the basis that it was political, and artists shouldn't be political. Now, of course, that position is only applied, that principle is only applied on one side of the argument. And that is a small example. On a more micro example, Jewish artists at the moment cannot really get work. It's like a silent shadow banning of Jewish artists. They cannot get, venues are cancelling shows, often on the basis of, and genuine. Often the venues are saying, we're really sorry, but we're a small business and we can't, they're targeting us now on social media for supporting Zionists, and our business cannot afford to be, subject to a boycott. And so in those areas, life is, in a very practical way, is becoming very difficult for members of the Jewish community. Now, that is not universal, and that is not across all industries. I think we need to be proportionate here. There is a sensible centre, and I believe a silent majority, who are not only outraged by this, but actually recognise that the war that Israel is fighting is fundamentally a war for basic Western democratic values. Now, the problem is that silent majority remains silent.
How do you know it exists?
It exists because they're not silent when, you have a conversation with them, in private, but they will not do so publicly because they don't want to be exposed to this intimidation. And that's where fundamentally I was quite wrong after the 7th of October when I saw the protests start on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney. And I saw, someone told me just recently that Australia has the highest per capita participation in pro-Palestinian protests of anywhere else in the world. And when I saw these protests initially, I saw this is going to backfire. Australians don't want their streets, sort of effectively invaded by, 20, 30, 50,000 people every weekend. You can't go to the city. Small businesses are suffering. There are no Australian flags at these protests. What I didn't appreciate was the extent to which ordinary, well-meaning people would be intimidated by the mob. They would be intimidated into silence, to turning the other way. And I think, that's one of the most disappointing aspects of the way in which, I guess, the Australian Jewish community has experienced the post-7th of October world.
Well, besides the silent majority of the public, do you feel that the authorities, both law enforcement and the political echelons, have been silent as well? Or do you feel that they've been supportive of the Jewish community, have taken action where needed?
I think the police are very much on side. I think there is a question of do they have the powers necessary to deal with this, and is there enough political will within the government? So I think we've got to separate the law enforcement authorities and the government. We also have a federal and state system, and the state government's responsible for police, not so much the federal government. And so I think there is no question that the government failed to understand what was happening on the ground and how it was impacting the Jewish community. I don't believe that the Australian government at either the federal level or the state level are motivated by antisemitism or antisemitic. I know that to be fundamentally not true. But that doesn't excuse failures to properly address antisemitism. On the one hand, federal government has announced and provided over $100 million in funding for the Jewish community for security, for shuls and schools. And they have taken other steps. They appointed an anti-Semitism envoy. So they recognise that there is a problem. But I think that the local political pressure that they feel under from, the 800,000 Muslims that are in Australia is distinct from 100,000 Jews, and a misunderstanding of how modern-day anti-Semitism on the left has manifested itself, resulted in it getting out of hand when, if the right leadership had been shown early on, I think it would have been significantly diminished.
Even if it's been a bit delayed, we've seen large kind of legislative packages being passed in Victoria, in New South Wales. I understand there was recently controversy in New South Wales in which one of these laws about protesting around places of worship and I believe community centers as well, was struck down by the Supreme Court, by the state Supreme Court, after it was challenged by Palestine Action Group in Sydney.
At a federal level as well, anti-hate speech laws have been passed. Now, of course, these things are very slow, and the laws have not been tested. The protest law was. I think, and when I reflect on this, and I'm someone that's advocated for strengthening of these anti-hate laws, there is a role for law reform to deal with this, but in my view, what really is required is seriously strong political leadership. And I think had we had that, both at a state and federal level, although New South Wales, the state government really, and it's a Labor left-wing government, it was outstanding, the political leadership. He got it from the beginning. He's the one shining example. Chris Minns, he really was outstanding. And that's demonstrated by the fact that he's tried to bring in these laws and it's been overruled by the court. But I don't believe that law reform is the solution here. I think what we need is leadership. What we need is our political leaders to draw a line in the sand and say, free speech is sacred, but when it crosses into incitement, to violence, and to have the clarity to be able to say, when we have people marching through the streets of Victoria, New South Wales, chanting, globalise the Intifada, and from the river to the sea, that these are inherently violent calls to action. Now, they got there eventually. The Prime Minister did say that chants like from the river to the sea were inherently violent. The head of ASIO, equivalent of Mossad, said the same thing. But it was too late. The genie was out of the box, and we didn't have enough leadership at all levels, not just political, within our universities. We had our education minister that, when asked, what he thinks about the term globalise the Intifada, responded something to the effect of, it means different things to different people. Well, that's just fundamentally false. And, when I was asked by the media after the bombing of the Adass Israel shul, was I surprised that this had happened? I responded that I'm not surprised, because when you allow people to march through the streets chanting globalise the Intifada week after week, this is what it looks like. It looks like synagogues being bombed. That is what globalising the Intifada looks like. And I think there was a failure to appreciate when it was happening. And once it's out of the bag, once you've normalised this, once you've normalised the idea that anyone who is a Zionist is now a genocide supporter, once you stop calling those things out, it's difficult to put back in the box.
There has been a trend across many different countries in which there has been a lack of understanding about certain aspects of the pro-Palestinian movement. They look at the campuses, and it took them a while before they were able to kind of realize that just allowing people to run roughshod doesn't actually work. They didn't run out of steam.
Do you think that there was a realization, or do you think that it really started to change when the Trump administration actually started to impose very real, serious financial penalties on those universities? I'm not sure. We've had issues on campus, we've had the encampments. I would say, with a couple of exceptions, it was never as extreme as in the United States. For example, explicit pro-Hamas support, and in part because we've got different free speech laws, as we don't have the enshrined right to free speech in the Constitution as they do in the United States. But what I discovered when I'm in New York and I speak to friends and business colleagues who often have children at places like Columbia, even though the encampments were more extreme and worse, at least at a place like Columbia, there is a critical mass of Jewish students. So they do have this, they're a minority, but they're not a minority in the same way as on Australian campuses, where we just have a smaller population. And there are one or two universities where there are. Monash University, for example, in Melbourne, which is named after Sir John Monash, a very famous Jewish Australian, I would say has been the standout in Australia of dealing with this issue. And I think Jewish students have felt the most supported because they have a critical mass. But at many other universities, it's a real small minority, and that sense of isolation that students feel on campus, even though it wasn't as explicitly pro-Hamas, was in some ways more confronting for those students.
You mentioned earlier strong leadership was needed to respond to this outgrowth of anti-Semitism. Famously, or perhaps infamously, there was a spat between the leadership of Israel and the leadership of Australia, in which Netanyahu called Prime Minister Anthony Albanese a weak leader. What was the spark for this? Was it for the spat? Was it the recognition of a Palestinian state by the Albanese government, or was this just an iceberg which kind of reared its head once everyone started paying attention to that to the bubbles of discontent between those two political leaderships?
I mean, recognition was, I think, the trigger. But, the reality is, on the one hand, it is undeniable that there's been, very noticeable shift in policy from the Australian government, really from before the 7th of October. And it's been slow, and it's sort of, in some ways, felt like death by a thousand cuts. At the same time, I don't think that intervention in that way by Prime Minister Netanyahu was helpful or productive. Firstly, one can, as we have as a Jewish community, very clearly criticise the government's decision to go ahead with unilateral recognition. We've criticised the shifts in voting pattern at the UN. But at the same time, the government of Australia is not the South African government. I don't think personalising this was a helpful contribution to the issue, and I don't think it was helpful for the Jewish community either. I think what we need to do is deal with these issues on their merits, and there is a lot of material that we have legitimate criticism to make of these shifts in policies, and that's where we should focus. The government has made several decisions which we fundamentally disagree with, but we also have to recognise that immediately after the 7th of October, they were actually very strong, and they came out very strongly that Israel has a right to defend itself, Hamas has to be removed from power, the hostages must be released. And then we saw this sort of slow descent and initially it was just an increased focus on humanitarian aid. And then I think eventually, while their positions never really fundamentally changed vis-a-vis the role of Hamas or release of hostages, it was a question of rhetoric and emphasis. And what we heard was this constant focus on humanitarian aid, which is fine. One can be a supporter of Israel's right to exist and express concern about the suffering of innocent Palestinians. Where we might disagree is where the moral blame lies for that suffering. But I think the government, and probably because of local political pressures, got that balance fundamentally wrong. And in doing so, that did, I don't think intentionally, because the government is not motivated by anti-Semitism at all, but it did end up allowing the anti-Semitism from the left to sort of flourish and be emboldened. And I'm not sure that, even today, I don't know if they truly appreciate the connection between those decisions. And the government's entitled to take the positions that it wants to take. I disagree with them. I don't think it's in the interests of Australia to take those positions. But there was a world where they could do so without emboldening those who are obsessed with delegitimizing the only Jewish state.
I can understand the statements of support for humanitarian aid and such. Australia was one of the countries that made a very proactive decision in its policy, not just rhetorically, to recognize a Palestinian state. And then there was also the other peak or I guess low point, we should say, in relations was the barring of Knesset member Simcha Rothman.
And Ayelet Shaked, former Justice Minister.
For some reason, people only seem to care when it was Rothman.
Well, a sitting minister, I guess, carries greater significance in a diplomatic sense.
I suppose so. What do you think what is the underlying motivation of the Albanese government to take these decisions?
On the issue of humanitarian aid, and it's linked, I think, and this is no secret, one of the biggest challenges for Israel in the Hasbara war, and for Jewish communities in the diaspora, is that throughout this war, which I think certainly the overwhelming majority of Australian Jews believes was a just war, the fact that you had certain Israeli ministers say terrible, terrible things without any criticism from the Prime Minister. Those comments just went, as if, silent is consent, did enormous damage to Israel. The decisions to refuse those visas is completely hypocritical. There are far worse actors, even if you believe these individuals are bad actors, far worse actors have been allowed into Australia, and Israel is a democracy, with a rule of law, with a Supreme Court. But notwithstanding that, I think, the sort of those irresponsible comments by those certain Israeli ministers has made it a lot easier for governments like Australia to take those positions. One can disagree with things that Simcha Rotman has said. There are many things that Simcha Rotman has said that I disagree with. But I don't support banning a sitting minister of the Israeli government from coming to Australia that was democratically elected because you have views that you disagree with. I don't think that the government recognised then, maybe they start to understand now, the impact that has on their own Jewish community. And the way that I would describe it is, the message that the Jewish community takes from these decisions is that Australia is not, the doors are not wide open for Israeli visitors. And that basically sends us a message that Jewish life in Australia is not secure, because we all have friends, family, relatives in Israel. Our schools are entirely, and youth movements are entirely dependent on shlichim and educators coming to Australia. Now, all of those people are coming, and I should say, come. The doors are open. Thousands of visas are being issued. But the government didn't articulate it. And even if you were going to go ahead with those visa bans, which I don't think was legitimate, but even if they were, they could have turned around and said, we're not letting in Simcha Rotman because he said A, B, and C, and D. But let me be very clear to our Israeli friends, come and swim in our beaches, come and teach in our schools, come and work on our farms. You're welcome here. And their failure to make it clear that they understood, even if you disagree with certain decisions and individuals within the Israeli government, their failure to be able to more obviously differentiate between a democratic ally, with whom you might disagree on certain things, and these barbaric terrorist organizations, I think is something that really made the Jewish community feel deeply uncomfortable. I'm more optimistic than I am, I guess, depressed about this situation, because I think I do really believe that there is a recognition, both within the government, even if they won't admit it, and certainly within Australian society, that they are able to differentiate fundamentally between good and evil. And, you can agree to disagree with an ally and a friend on certain issues, and that's fine. There are many Israelis that disagree with decisions of their own government, but we need to get the balance right and the signals that are being sent, and the Australian government hasn't got that right. But I do believe that there is a desire, I think, to rebuild that relationship. And that onus is also on Israel to do so. Israel is one of the only countries in the world where most countries that are accused of being bad actors say they're going to do lovely things and then do terrible things. Israel says they're going to do terrible things, but doesn't actually go ahead and do these terrible things. I can't exaggerate the extent to which I think some of the rhetoric from certain Israeli ministers have been really damaging to diaspora Jewry. And I think the signals that some of those individuals, not all of them, have sent intentionally or unintentionally to Jewish communities in the diaspora in doing so is that we're not primarily concerned about you. You're not part of the equation anymore. And that is a very serious threat to the bond between diaspora Jewry and the state of Israel, and for the Australian Jewish community that is overwhelmingly Zionist and connected to Israel is very confronting.
So let's talk about that connection a little bit. How has Israel been working to maintain that connection, if at all? And do Australian Jews feel, does the Australian diaspora, Australian Jewry feel that it's been left out in the cold, especially when it's become the subject of so many anti-Semitic attacks, some of which appear to have been directed by a foreign state power, which is trying to strike at what it sees as the soft underbelly of the Zionist enterprise?
It's really interesting, and it's sort of like we hold two truths at once, because what we've seen in the Jewish community in Australia since the 7th of October is an explosion in the sense of Jewish peoplehood and connection. And we have, one of the things that the Zionist Federation does is, we administer all Israel programs, Taglit and Massa, and we are overwhelmed with demand. And so the Jewish community, even parts of the community that would never turn up to an event or wouldn't even contemplate sending their child, on a gap year to Israel, we've seen this sort of explosion, this desire to connect. I think that is in part a result of, a sense of isolation and a realization that perhaps the role that those individuals who weren't that connected before felt they had, the seat at the table that they felt they had in Australia isn't quite as secure as they thought. But I think it's also connected to, frankly, the resilience and inspiration, not from the Israeli government, but from the Israeli people. In the same way that after the 7th of October, you saw Israeli society rise to the occasion, right? Civil society in every single part of the country. I think diaspora Jewry saw that and they felt very connected to that. But I don't think that is thanks to particular decisions of the government. And by the way, I don't think, particularly in the Australian Jewish community, Israel's fighting a war. And a war, a war that certainly at points in time felt existential, maybe not now, thank God. And so I'm not suggesting, I don't think many in the Jewish community would suggest that, the relationship with Australian Jewry or even diaspora Jewry should have been the Israeli government's number one consideration. But I think when, you have the Diaspora Affairs Minister, as we've seen recently, attack a mainstream Jewish community organisation in Britain, right? The Board of Deputies as being woke because they were critical of a decision to invite a far-right activist. You can agree to disagree on those issues, but it was the reaction to a community that had experienced, effectively, a terror attack on their soil. British Jews murdered for being Jews, for their mainstream representative body to then be accused of, being called a woke body that didn't stand up to the government's decision to go ahead with unilateral recognition, which was not true. They were highly critical of that decision. And, I've got no skin in the game. This was the British Jewish community. I thought that was...
Commonwealth.
Right? Commonwealth. Well, no, we have our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But I really found that deeply, deeply troubling because I think the message the diaspora Jewry received from that sort of rhetoric was, this is partisan now. It's not about, we're not one people. We're only one people if you're on one particular side of politics, and that was deeply, deeply troubling, I think. But it's interesting that notwithstanding that, I would say, and this is why I'm optimistic, I've got a Jewish community that is more awake, connected to Israel, to their fellow Jews than I've ever witnessed before. Perhaps I'm a bit young to tell you, but from the stories that I hear, maybe only after the 6-Day War.
Do you think that the turnout that you've seen for the World Zionist Congress elections is indicative of that kind of support?
Absolutely. I think most Australian Jews probably have no idea what the World Zionist Congress does. Yet, I had people that would have, very disconnected from any sort of, mainstream Jewish community involvement, that were ringing me and asking me and they want to register and they want to vote. And we saw a huge turnout in the vote. And I think, the other very interesting part of it was, we saw in Australia for the first time, it's happened elsewhere in the world, Eretz HaKodesh, effectively Haredi groups. Now, one participated in the elections. Now, one can be cynical about that involvement, but I actually see it as a real positive. I think the fact that you have Haredi groups wanting to be a part of the world Zionist movement is effectively, it's the last stone. It's a recognition that Zionism is an inherent part of everyone's Jewish identity today. I mean, I believe it always was, but I think that is whether or not it's, there are also financial incentives and other things. That's fine. That's real life. But I see it overwhelming as a positive. And I think that what the global Zionist movement need to do is find spaces and ensure that we are allowing spaces for people, if it's Haredim, if it's people on the right, if it's people on the left. We need to have a broader tent with boundaries, but as broad a tent as possible, because we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to seize on what it was no doubt the trauma of the 7th of October, but transform it and seize on this explosion of Jewish identity and Jewish connection for something positive. Because I'm someone that grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where my Jewish bucket was, yes, had quite a bit of the Holocaust trauma, but had a bucket full of all of the positives of Jewish values and tradition and ritual and family and knowledge. And my contemporaries whose Jewish identity was only built off the Holocaust, Jewish guilt doesn't last more than one generation. You can't pass it on to your children. And nor would you want to, frankly. So I think it's very important that we learn the lessons of the past and we ensure that the trauma of the 7th of October, while never forgotten, is seized upon to actually bring and highlight all of the optimistic positives of Jewish identity and where else and what else is better evidence of that than the accomplishments of the State of Israel. And that's why I think we need to, and this is certainly what our objective is, to simply get as many, not just children, not just students, but adults, families, to Israel as possible, because once they are here, the rest flows for those that haven't been before.
How can Israelis, how can Israel, how can national institutions like World Zionist Organization and such, how can they help Australian Jews with whatever is afflicting them?
I think, like any relationship, a relationship needs to have reciprocity, so it needs to go both ways, and you need to have a dialogue. Because if you can't engage with, same if it's with two individuals, if they don't have dialogue and they can't engage, and that includes difficult conversations, it's difficult to form a relationship. And that's why I say that we need to create spaces, and the World Zionist Congress and the World Zionist Organization is an example. We need to create the spaces for dialogue between Israel and the diaspora. There are many diaspora Jews that don't really understand how Israeli society, works, but there are a lot more Israelis that have no understanding of diaspora Jewry. And even before the 7th of October, I talked to our partners at Taglit about a reverse birthright. We should bring Israelis to diaspora communities for them to learn and see what it means to be Jewish outside of Israel. And I think if we understand a little bit more about each other, there will be more mutual respect and understanding that will, I think, facilitate what is a very substantial, let's say, sum of money that the World Zionist Organization ultimately has at its disposal to be applied more productively. I don't think it's a tug of war between the diaspora and Israel. Where should the funding go? I think that's a simplistic view of the World Zionist Congress. I think what it's about is creating that sense of connection, and that includes having honest, difficult conversations in both directions. And, there are some things that we all just want to, sometimes there are things you'll see in any bureaucratic organization that can be a turn-off, particularly to young Jews for their first time. But there are some incredibly inspiring people and individuals, and someone like Rav Doron Perez, and of course who has gone through this horrific personal but really national collective trauma, but who is such an inspiring human being and individual that, notwithstanding everything that his and his family has endured, is able to look past and not focus on on our differences. And I like to focus on individuals like that, who I think have the capacity to inspire diaspora Jewry.
Hopefully this conversation has inspired diaspora Jewry and Israelis to work on that connection a little bit more. And maybe we'll see what happens when there's reverse birthright. We just got to figure out how to close the gap on that 20-hour flight.
Please solve that one for me. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.